Good evening. My name is Marshan Allen. I am the Vice President of Advocacy and Partnerships that Represent Justice, an organization that uses the power of stories through film, series, and original content to help create change for demand change within the criminal justice system. I want to thank our speakers today for participating and the audience for joining us. On these grounds, presents an opportunity to discuss strategies and practices that create a supportive, safe learning environment where students can thrive. Around the country, there have been cases where children like Naya and Shakara have been criminalized for normal adolescent behavior. Last year in Michigan, a judge incarcerated a 15-year-old girl for violating her probation because she failed to complete her online schoolwork. In October, ProPublica exposed a school system in Tennessee where Black children as young as 8 years old were arrested and sent to detention centers for not intervening in a schoolyard fight. This conversation will explore the criminalization of normal adolescent behavior among youth of color, its connection to the school to prison pipeline and extreme sensitive youth, and highlight alternative approaches that hold youth accountable in ways that do not traumatize and criminalize them. I wanted to take the time now to introduce our great panelists tonight. First, we have Naya Kinley. First, we have Naya Kinley. She was a student at Spring Valley High School in Columbia, South Carolina, when she witnessed and filmed the assault at Spring Valley, during which she was arrested on disturbing school charges and taken to a detention center. Naya eventually withdrew from Spring Valley High School and opted instead to earn a GED. Naya later joined other South Carolina students in a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the state's law against disturbing school, which was applied disproportionately to Black students. She also interned at the nonprofit African American Policy Forum, working alongside Kimberly Crenshaw to raise awareness about how the school to prison pipeline impact all students, but especially Black girls. Our next panelist is Kristin Henning. She is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law. She was previously the lead attorney for the Juvenile Unit of DC Public Defender Service and is currently the director of the Mid-Atlantic Juvenile Defender Center. Kris has trained state actors across the country on the impact of racial bias in the juvenile and criminal legal systems. Kris also writes extensively about race, adolescence, and policing. Her new book, The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth, was released in September. She has won several awards, including the 2021 Juvenile Leadership Prize by the Juvenile Law Center and the Robert E. Shepard Jr. Award for Excellence in Juvenile Defense by the National Juvenile Defender Center. And last but certainly not least, is Vivian Anderson. She is the founder and executive director of Every Black Girl Incorporated, a national campaign and program that centers and supports Black girls. Vivian has long been an activist and healer, working as a director of youth programming at the Harlem YMCA and executive director of Momentum Teens. In 2015, Vivian moved to South Carolina, inspired by the Spring Valley assault, to create an organization to fight state-sponsored violence against young Black women. Since then, Vivian and Every Black Girl Incorporated has grown into an organization advancing radical systematic change needed to have a world worthy of the genius and heart of every Black girl. I want to thank all our panelists for joining us today. Thank you. And I want to start with you, Naya, because what we see in the film, what we saw in the film, and what we know about what happened today is really because of you. In the film, we saw a school resource officer, Ben Field, is called to remove Shakara from the classroom. When Fields entered the classroom, you immediately took out your phone and began recording because of Fields' reputation as Officer Slam. You also screamed and cried out in support of Shakara as Fields assaulted her, which to me, I believe was a normal response to what you were witnessing. But you were arrested for that. You were charged with disturbing schools, which carried a maximum penalty of 90 days in jail and a $1,000 fine. And I guess I was curious and want to know, like, why did you choose to stand up for Shakara and ask other students to do the same? And I guess the second question would be, how did you feel when you learned that your speaking out and reaction could be considered a crime?
Standing, everybody says, oh, you stood up for Shakara, but that was literally, just like you said, my reaction to what was going on in the class. In that moment, I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm standing up for this girl. It was me literally thinking, what the hell is going on in our classroom, in front of us? I can't believe this is going on. Exactly what I was saying. It was literally just my reaction. I'm a dramatic person. So, I don't know. I just didn't feel like I was standing up. I really didn't. I never looked at it as standing up for her. Of course, indeed, that definitely what it was. But it was more of just a reaction, like, to what was going on. And once I found out that I could be charged with disturbing schools, I was kind of familiar with the charge already, just from being in District 2. But when I realized that situation was landing me in jail, I couldn't believe it. I felt like my initial reaction wasn't that something needed to be changed until I started, doing more organizing and learning, like, okay, wait, girl, they really took you to jail for literally just reacting to something crazy that went on in your classroom. And so that kind of fueled me to, just play a huge role in the ACLU case. Because I just thought it was absurd and that it had to go. I was like, oh no, it happened to the wrong person.
It sure did. And I find it intriguing that you say that your reaction to it. And I think that you were responding to something that happened. Your reaction was a normal response to that. And what was strange to me was that you went to jail for something that the officer was eventually fired for. That behavior, your reaction to that behavior was something he was fired for. So the adults and the system found that behavior was wrong, and they punished and fired the officer for that. But at the same time, they put you in jail for reacting to that improper conduct of the officer. And I just thought that was strange. But I thank you for your answers. And I know you say that you want to stand up for Shakara, but
but in that moment, I was that person that was there for her when nobody else said something, Absolutely. When you look back and you look at all the details, the teachers didn't say nothing, the students, you're like, yeah, you were the only one who said something for that young lady in the class. So.
Right. And I want to give you credit because, again, like, we would have never known what actually happened without you pulling out your phone and recording that event. So I thank you for doing that and commend you.
It was Tony Robinson who pulled out the phone. I just told him, my phone wouldn't start quick enough, but I told them, I just said, get that camera out. But it was Tony Robinson, and I always put his name out because he recorded that video. And he made sure it got out. I still can't believe he recorded.
Yeah, and I literally, I'm sorry, because this is probably going to be the interruption nobody wants. Tony didn't get arrested. So when we talk about Black girls in this whole conversation, he didn't get arrested. Naya did. His video went out. Nothing happened to that young man. Everything happened to this girl. So when we talk about this, and thank you, Tony, like, not coming after you or anything, but I think there's actually some things that we need to be clear about. And when we talk about this conversation, when we talk about the disparities, what happens to discipline with Black girls, let's be very clear. Only, like, so and I know you got a whole, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You good.
Next, I want to turn to Kris, but before I do, Kris, I want to play a clip of a journalist, Amanda Ripley. The clip, unfortunately, didn't make it into the film, but I think that is very pertinent to our conversation today. So I want to share this clip with the panelists as well as the audience.
The use of the Disturbing Schools Law was a harmful, but yet lawful form of structural violence. And so we were utilizing that law as a blanket law to deal with schoolhouse conflict.
So we are doing the opposite of what works. Our focus on getting kids to be quiet and sit still and obey worked really well for an industrial society. And it doesn't work well anymore for lots of reasons, but particularly because the policy is like a century behind the science and psychology of juvenile brains. All the evidence shows us that adolescents, they're hardwired to value short-term rewards over long-term consequences and to value their peers' responses more than authority. And once you get into the juvenile justice system, it is really hard to get out. So why is that the way that we are managing behavior in schools? It's like we've outlawed adolescence. We've gotten to a point where we give police officers a lot more leeway and benefit of the doubt than kids. I think we can do better. I think we can hire social workers at the rate we hired police officers. And you know who will be the first to tell you that? Police officers.
Kris, in the clip we just saw, journalist Amanda Ripley talks about juvenile brain development and how it impacts youth decision-making, that youth are hardwired to value short-term rewards over long-term consequences. She also talked about how schools, through their overly punitive policies, are essentially outlawing adolescents. But this is not just a school problem. This is something that is happening outside of school as well. As you know, America has a long history of failing to view and treat children, particularly Black children, as children. How has that historical reality laid the foundation for both the criminalization of normal adolescent behavior among Black youth, as well as the dehumanization of Black youth in response to serious violent offenses?
Yeah, I'm going to start by repeating that most important sentence out of what you said, which is America has a long history of failing to treat Black children like children. And if you look back to the era of slavery, when Black children were treated as the property of the purported master, to the civil rights era, when you have Emmett Till, who can be lynched, quite frankly, as a symbolic statement that white America would not tolerate integration. That's what that's about. But in order to justify such a brutal act, America has to create a narrative to attempt to justify that behavior. So what do they say? They say that Black children are a threat to white America. And in Emmett Till's case in particular, he's a threat to white women. Then we go to the 1990s and we have this temporary uptick in crime in America. And who becomes the principal target of this new war on crime, war on property, on poverty? It is Black children. In particular, very explicitly, Black children get labeled as super predators. And politicians can see that they have a lot to gain from manipulating race and crime. So again, in very intentional and explicit ways, Black children are exploited for the political gain. And I say all of that. That's the historical backdrop that was very intentionally laid as a part of American history. Here's the deal. That intentional narrative that gets crafted to treat Black children badly then gets embedded in the American psyche, right? And so now everybody, is afraid of Black children. And when I say, we talk a lot about policing, I'm not just talking about police officers in a blue uniform, but the average citizen, is driven by this irrational manufactured fear of Black children. And so this notion of criminalizing normal adolescent behaviors, engaging in normal adolescent reactions. So I love, this Naya is telling us this was a reaction, a normal reaction to seeing a sister girl being treated poorly in school. Anybody with an ounce of dignity and self-respect, and I so appreciate you, wants to stand up and speak out, right? And that's a normal response. And in the clip, you know, she's talking about normal adolescent brain development, right? That's what a normal teenager is going to do without doing the whoa, stop, think about what might happen, right? It's a normal response, but yet that behavior is portrayed as dangerous, as criminal. So you've got the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors among Black children. And that's especially true for Black girls, right? Black girls being portrayed as loud and, you know, unladylike and, you know, everything counter to, you know, white feminist ideal becomes criminalized, right? Not just rejected, but criminalized. She goes to jail. You know, my heart goes out every time I think about that, Naya. And also Shakara, you know, being, and it's even disputed, you know, whether she had the phone out or not, right? But even had it been, so she's criminalized and physically hurt, harmed, ripped out of a chair for doing what teenagers do all over the world, looking at a cell phone, or purportedly looking at a cell phone, normal adolescent behaviors, what all of us did as kids. And so that's where the foundation, it starts intentionally, and then it lives on in America as a fear of Black children and Black girls in particular. And I know you asked about more serious offenses. I mean, you think about the 90s and that super predator narrative, that super predator narrative led to laws that are still on the books today that make it easier to transfer or to try Black children in particular as adults for more crimes at younger ages, with more severe long-term outcomes. That all started as an intentional narrative for somebody's gain, and now lives on in very, very painful ways for Black children.
Wow, thank you. As I was mentioning earlier, like I was reading your book, and some of the examples that you highlight there about the difference between how Black kids engaging in the same behavior that white kids does, and it's seen as more dangerous. And I was just like really, really intrigued and actually disturbed by that, like the wearing of a hoodie or going to a party, how, you know, even the example of your client who built the fake Molotov cocktail, and he was charged with a crime, whereas the white child who did the same thing was put into a chemistry class. But I definitely feel you and appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that.
Absolutely.
Vivian, I want to turn to you next. On these grounds, traces a particular incident in which a school police officer assaults a Black girl in the classroom. What does research tell us broadly about disparities in school discipline policies and practices today? And how are students of color, particularly Black girls, impacted by disparities in discipline?
Well, I think we've been talking about it, right? Kris like really laid it out for us, right? But when we talk about Black girls in particular, Black girls are 6 times more likely than their white girls to be suspended, 3 times more likely to receive 1 or more in school suspensions than their white female students, 3 times more likely to be restrained than white female students, 2 times more likely to receive corporal punishment than white female students, 4 times more likely to be arrested than white female students, 3 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement than white female students, right? And so when we look at those numbers, we really get to talk about the fact that every child is doing the same behavior, but which child is punished for it? And I think that goes to like the fact that Black girls and women, because we get to hold this full narrative around it, since slavery, right? Who have we been known to be? We're like the puppet, or this child, this thing that plays with master's daughters and everything, or the children. There's a way that Black girls, when we talk about this hierarchy, Black girls are always on the bottom, right? And so even when we talk about Black girls don't get to like, so I brought that up earlier around Naya. Let's be very clear, Naya was arrested. Everybody, like, I'm one who, I just don't go into anything without really looking into it. Naya's video, she didn't get arrested because her video went out there. Naya got arrested because she dared to stand up. She dared to like challenge these 2 white men So there's a whole another level of conversation that needs to be had. We can talk about the disparities of what's happening in the classroom. We can't talk about the disparities until we talk about the adults that in these spaces who hold those spaces. So Black, white, how everybody is looking at Black girls, right? And so I have just a different take on everything. So yes, we see all the research. Black and brown children are punished at disproportionate rates than white kids. But who's making those calls? And I think it's a time for us to there's something that's happening, and I know it's going to be some conversation later around this. We keep talking about how kids get to be held accountable. My work will always be, how do we hold adults accountable for not letting children be children? And so in that time, and it's such a space as this in our America, Naya did what everything said we were supposed to do. You see something, you say something. She said something, and then what happened? So there's a different context, because very clearly, when we talk about the disparities and the different portions that's happening, let's be very clear. Shakara asked to leave that classroom, and the teacher said no. Let's be very clear about that. She asked to leave that classroom, but he wanted her to leave on his terms. So it's not about the kids. Kids get to be held accountable, but are we going to hold adults accountable? And so I'm going to keep going there, and I'm probably taking your conversation to a whole different place, but that's always on my heart, because we keep talking about what's happening to kids. We know the numbers. I can spew numbers out to you all night. Let's be on a solution-driven side. And until we address some real stuff, we're going to keep saying the same thing over and over. And so, okay, thank you.
Thank you. And those are valid points that you're making about holding adults accountable instead of kids. I mean, kids are going to be kids. And I think that's what Amanda Ripley's clip and her comments are about. And even what Kris is explaining to us today, like kids are kids and they're going to react and respond in certain ways. But I also want to talk about other disparities. Like the disparity is not just in the school discipline too. We're learning that disparity rates for which youth of color are subject to life without parole and other stream sentences are also a function of laws and policies, practices, and decisions made daily in cases throughout the country. Overcharging unnecessary transfers of youth to adult courts and sentencing and parole decision individual cases are major factors in racial disparities. So these disparities, the root cause of them are definitely what Kris pointed out about just the causes of what went back to the Jim Crow and slavery and even the super predator myth years ago, just deep rooted in American history. Again, I want to turn to you, Naya, because after you were arrested and charged for speaking out on behalf of Shakara, with the help of the ACLU, you sued the Richland County Sheriff Department, Richland School District, and others for violating your constitutional right. And last month, I know that the court ruled that the Disturbing Schools law that you were charged under were unconstitutional and has prevented schools and law enforcement from charging students under this law. I just want to ask you, what is it like to be a plaintiff in the ACLU lawsuit and to help bring about this momentum change in the school district and at least in South Carolina, but it probably has some impact around the country as well?
I feel like we made history.
Yeah,
I really do. That is just a huge victory. I think that was like my favorite outcome from this entire situation. And 6 years later, I can't believe it took 6 years, but it was worth the wait, because just the overwhelming feeling of like, wow, we did that. It was amazing, for real.
and I imagine there's some type of vindication too, because just the idea that you had this normal reaction and got charged with a crime for doing it, and now the courts were saying, no, you can't do that. This is way too vague, and to it's like an umbrella that captures all of this, different reactions and behaviors and stuff of students. But I can imagine that you feel vindicated too for the courts ruled and ruled the law was unconstitutional.
Right. I was always that student in school who was like being made an example of. So like, I feel like that was somebody's last time making an example of me,
Yes. And bravo to you too. In your book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalized Black Youth, you talk about policing as trauma. And you define trauma as any distressing and disturbing experience that causes significant fear, helplessness, confusion, and other disruptive feelings, intense enough to have a lasting negative effect on a person's attitude, behavior, and social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. What are some of the traumas that Black youth experience with criminalization, or policing, and hyper surveillance?
So I really want, I'm going to answer your question about trauma from the research lens, but before I do that, I think it's critical that every time we talk about trauma, we think about it in terms of the narratives and the stories that we have heard from young people about how traumatizing police contact is. And so I think about, you mentioned earlier, Marshan, the story of the kids in Rutherford County, Tennessee, who were arrested for what wasn't even a crime. They were arrested for behavior that wasn't even a crime. And I remember in particular reading that news story and just being devastated to read about these girls, 8 and 12, year old girls who are being pulled out of their classroom. And what did the news article say? It talks about them crying hysterically. Right? I can't tell you the number of clients, young people that I have represented over the years, who talk about how terrifying it is, how traumatizing it is, how afraid they are of what the reaction from society is going to be, how embarrassing it is to be snatched out of class and dragged down the hallway. So I think when we talk about trauma, it's important to think about it from the stories of the kids. I think about another client who was chased, little bitty kid, 9-year-old, chased around and literally soiled his pants. Right? As a child, that's how traumatizing it was. And then one other example, really recent example of a 17-year-old client of mine who was looking out of the window, and he saw police cars sitting outside. So he holed himself up inside of the apartment for over 2 hours because he was afraid to come out, because he was afraid to have contact with the police. And I know people listening are thinking, well, wait, maybe he was afraid to go out because he had done nothing wrong. He had done nothing wrong at all, no crime whatsoever. And his mother, I could hear his mother in the background because he called us to say he was stuck in the house. And his mother in the background is yelling, boy, you're just being paranoid. And I remember thinking, no, he's traumatized. He's not paranoid. So you've got Black children in some parts of the country who are afraid to go out, who decide I'm going to stay in because I'm so afraid of going outside and encountering the police. So that's the narrative. And there's so many stories like that. But then you match the narratives. What the empirical research shows is that Black children in particular who have lived in heavily surveilled neighborhoods, who are the frequent targets of police stops, live with and report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, which means that they're always on guard in that state of fight, flight, or freeze because they're so afraid of being in contact with the police. And what's so unfortunate about it is that trauma, that fear of police, transfers over to other adult figures who might be trying to help them, right? So they might, be resistant at first, to me or to Vivian or to anybody who wants to mentor because they're afraid, they don't trust, other people who enter into their spaces. The research also shows that young people, Black children in particular, who live in these neighborhoods, heavily surveilled neighborhoods, also report poor sleep habits and either an inability to sleep at all, insomnia, or they report poor sleep quality, waking up all hours of the night. So I represent children in Washington, D.C. I go to court and I see my kids sleeping in the hallway and I'm thinking, wow, why are you asleep? And then I begin to talk to them and understand that's because they can't sleep at all. right? The anxiety that's associated with all of this. And what's so powerful about the research is that it shows that trauma occurs not only from being the direct target of a police encounter, but from watching it, right? So just like what Naya talks about, the trauma associated with watching your classmate, right, get assaulted, and just the fear of being the next victim of some police contact or some police brutality is just the same as being there, meaning that it produces the same kind of traumatic symptoms and traumatic responses. And so, I'll say the last thing I'll say about this is there's been some research showing that even watching these kind of traumatic police brutality on television, even involving somebody you don't know, George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Makia Bryant, the girl who was the 9-year-old girl who was pepper sprayed in New York. I mean, on and on. Just Tracy Taylor Bracey body slammed in Florida. All of that, just watching those incidents is enough to create the same kinds of trauma. And in that particular study, they showed, since we're talking about girls, that girls experience that even more than boys, right? So that watching those events on television is even more traumatic for girls than for boys. So it's the narrative. Talk to the kids. They'll tell you how traumatic it is, but then we've got empirical research to back that up.
Oh, wow. I can definitely relate to that fear of the police. I remember when I was growing up, the police would just stop us for doing nothing. Yeah. Make us pull our pants down. They would search us and do, and like in the streets, they would do it. And it would be times that we would be out playing and the police would pull up and we would just run. Not because we were doing anything wrong, but just because we didn't want to be humiliated or go through that experience anymore. I had a time where the police actually framed me with drugs. They planted drugs on me and they knew it wasn't mine. But those type of experiences, it still sticks with me today. And I remember when I first came home, and this was like 2016, I came home 2016, and 2016. And in 2017, I was pulled over by the police. And when he got to the car, my younger cousin was in the car with me, but when the police asked me for my license insurance, I immediately told them, like, look, my insurance is in my glove compartment. Is it okay for me to get it? And I did it. And after he left, my cousin was like, I never thought to ask that. I just would have reached for it. And I was like, you know what, just watching the news and seeing how, people reaching for their insurance card and the police reacting to it, so it sticks with me, and it sticks with, as you were saying, like sticks with everyone, those just from seeing it on the news or experiencing it yourself. Vivian, school safety is important and students should be held accountable. And I know you're going to correct me on that, and for their inappropriate behavior in restorative, age-appropriate, and effective trauma-informed ways. What are some of the alternative approaches you're seeing that are allowing schools to reach that goal, that is keeping students, teachers, staff, administrators safe while holding students accountable in ways that do not traumatize or criminalize them?
Yeah, I am always going to go back to that. I think we really want to be clear that we always say when things happen, we go to the child, not the adults or systems, right? We're always like, the child has to be, I get the Bible said a child should lead them, but like, real talk, like, why are we placing everything on children without looking at the overall picture of everything, right? And so what I'm watching right now, and one of the examples that I can give, because I know whoever's listening is like, okay, we hear you, lady, we need some concrete stuff. So in Milwaukee, Heather Sattler, right? She's a woman that I've been able to be in relationship with. She does restorative justice work. And so the community at the Alliance School engages in school-wide restorative justice practices, right? And so they literally go in and they have these restorative justice circles. And it's not just about when kids are in it with kids and how to redirect kids. They literally bring administrators, principals, like, kids are having issues with you. Let's figure out how we all do this together. right? And so this restorative justice model, and it's not just happening in Milwaukee with Heather's work, but it's happening across the nation, right? And we see it in other countries as well. I think that's one of the things when we can look at like, what's the root of it versus looking at behavior. We're looking at what's creating this behavior. And I think that's one of the restorative justice models that's happening across. We saw how kids stood up and they took police out of school. And they're like, we need more social services supports. This is what we need, because we're very clear, and I would be remiss if I did not say this. There is no research that shows that SROs in schools reduce violence. What we do know, they actually increase violence because they become part of the perpetrators of violence, right? And not just physical violence, sexual assault. There's so many levels of violence that are happening, even when it's not SROs doing it, but teachers who are harming kids, SROs stand aside. And so that's another form of violence, right? The kids is like, who I'm going to talk to, because this SRO know that this teacher is doing this to me, but nobody's standing up for me because I'm the child and I'm supposed to know better and I'm supposed to do better, and you're gonna fix me, right? And so that's why I'm like, we keep talking about the kids, but if we're gonna be really honest about ourselves, we created these kids. And that's something that we don't want to sit with. That's the world we're living in today. We don't want to talk about what we created. Kids are only going by what we created for them. So if they stuck on social media, why they stuck on social media? Because we talking about social media. So there's some things where we want to keep making kids and hear me well. Children want to be held accountable. They're like, I have so many kids like, yes, I did it wrong. They don't want to have punitive punishment. They want redirection. We're stuck on what it means to punish kids versus like, oh, here's the path. But we haven't dealt with adults who are still living with their punitive punishment that they went through, right? So we can talk about this. Y'all heard me tell my story. I know what it meant to be chased around that classroom. Somebody didn't have that same experience. I'm one of 10. My brothers have spent all kind of stuff, like all type of space in criminal justice facilities. Don't mean my mother did something wrong. Don't mean this is like, but it's how we look at who gets to be deemed redeemable and who gets to just keep being punished. And so what we're saying now, Black girls are the ones who are just like, hey, forget your Black girl magic. You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. You should do better. You should do better because you're supposed to do this and you got to uplift everything. And so I think with our children of color, they don't get the right to have childhood. And I think some of the things that's happened in the schools, Kris's work, right? The rage of innocence. They get to be raging about like, I get to have my innocence and I get to be enraged that you've taken it from me. So if you really look at the context of her book, not just the content and all these stories, but the context, she's saying children saying, why won't y'all let us be children? Yes. And if we stand there and if we keep working from that point, we get to check ourselves, but we want to keep checking children. So you won't have me talk about what children need to do better. I'm going to always talk about what I can do better and what other adults can do better. That's the conversation we need to be having. If we can have a former president the way he was, ain't no way we're going to be condemning these children. So I'm going to like go there and then I'm going to stop.
but thank you. I want to go back to something you mentioned because it was a really good point you made about the SROs and how they're the ones that are increasing violence. Because when we watch the film, we see that Chikara wasn't doing anything wrong. She was sitting at a desk. She was quiet. She wasn't disturbing anyone. And also the one that came in and actually disturbed the school and flipping her and her desk over and caused a disruption. So I definitely feel you and understand what you're.
So let's go back a little further though, right? She asked to leave the classroom. Yes. Let's go back there. She said, according to my IEP, here's what's legally right for me. And he said no. But then he wanted the teacher. I'm not talking about Ben Fields, the teacher. Mr. Long was like, oh, you got a phone. You got to get up. He wanted to make it punitive. He could have let her go a long time ago, but he wanted to be about him. So adults, we got to check ourselves and our egos. Ego is playing a role. And I know people are going to come from my throat. All these people that's going to watch this, I know you're going to come from my throat, but also be very clear. I was an educator. I actually taught. I actually was in a classroom with 25 first graders. And then the second day of that school day, the other first grade teacher left. So I had 50 first graders. So don't tell me what I don't know. So let me tell you, I know what it means to be in a classroom full of kids. I've been in high school rooms. I've been all over. So if you want to come for me, I'll need you to know all about me. So when I say this man could have let that girl go when she asked, but he wanted to be dominating. And so that's another level of conversation. Adults, we got to check our egos. We got to check ourselves.
Thank you. I was just curious, do you know if anything ever happened to the teacher for not following the plan? Nothing?
We have no idea. I actually just, when I was shopping for the catering this weekend, Ms. Vivian, I saw him like for the first time since that. I saw him and he saw me and we didn't speak, but we saw each other definitely. And I just was like, I stared him down like a hole, and it was nothing.
Wow, so there was no accountability for him for not even found. That's crazy. All right, thank you all. I have one final question, and I guess anyone you can answer, and all of you all can answer it first of all, but you can go in any order you want to. But it's like, what resources should be available to schools to allow them to appropriately and effectively respond to normal adolescent behavior internally without relying on the legal system, such as training for staff and trauma-informed practices, more school counselors and social workers, sufficient special ed behavior support staff, and implementation of positive behavior intervention support. And also, how can ordinary citizens, like our audience is watching today, how can they help to draw attention to and raise awareness of these critical issues? Anyone?
You know, we can all answer. I think we're all being polite.
Naya, we all being polite. I'm like, Naya, y'all go. Y'all go. I've been talking. Y'all know how I do, so I'll let y'all go.
I need a second. I'm just gonna be real and say I need a second.
And I know that Vivian, you actually mentioned about restorative justice practices and talk about the kids wanting more social workers, things like that. But I was just curious, it's like what some of the other things that can be done to help.
Yeah, one of the things, like, there are some people who just watched this full documentary. What if they shared it with others, right? I'm very clear, every Black girl does some work to be with schools, not just with like students, but we work with educators, because I believe, like, in order for every Black girl to thrive, the world around her has to thrive. So there's work that we do in every Black girl to actually support folks in educational systems. And I watch educators transform how they even create their classrooms, right? Because of the work they went through with us, right? And so, not trying to like boost myself up, but I do some really good work. Real talk.
Please boost yourself.
I'm just like, I love young people that much. And I believe education is the key to liberation. So I want all our kids to be educated. So I always want to go in, because I also know teachers are under a lot of distress as well. And it comes down. So the work here with every Black girl, but I also know if you go to the Represent Justice website, you're also going to look at things that, like, here's some other ways, but you said something very unique. Ordinary citizens. What does that mean?
Well,
you're a person on this planet.
Right.
When I tell you there's conversations that's happening in your home, and you can shift those conversations. I want everybody who's listening to have the courage to shift the conversation. It ain't always, it can be lonely sometimes. It can be scary sometimes. I'm not asking anybody to get on a plane when they see something, they hear something, and they travel somewhere. I'm saying, in the space that you dwell, have it be different. If it pings your heart, speak. If it pings your heart, speak.
Right.
If it pings your heart, speak. It may not make sense to you in that moment, but just speak it. And then you'll know from there. So I really feel like people ask this question because they want permission. I'm telling you, you don't need to have permission to do what you know is right. You know what you need to do. Nobody needs to give you permission. Be it, do it, do it, do it. You don't need permission. Nobody gave me permission. Nobody gave me permission. Naya called me out. She called me forth. I heard her. You hear stuff. So don't ask me this question if you ain't ready for the answer. That ping in your heart, answer it. Can't nobody give that to you but you. So the ordinary citizen, as we call them, stop being ordinary and be extraordinary and step up. Oh. That's my answer.
Beautiful.
How do we come after that? I think the answer for me and Kris.
I know that's right. I will say this though. Because literally I have watched, Vivian's work from afar. We have a mutual friend in common, Alex. And so even before this film, came out, she told me about you. There's a woman I need you to meet. And a friend of mine, a psychologist friend of mine, taught me a word some years back. And the word was this, and it's really a phrase, that every single child in this country needs at least one irrationally caring adult. And that children will do better if they have a team of irrationally caring adults. That's Vivian right there, right? Irrationally caring adult, meaning that we know what adolescence looks like. Every single one of us as a teenager made a mistake. First of all, we're talking about half the stuff we've been talking about today weren't even mistakes, but that every single teenager will make a mistake, right? And that we show grace and we show love and we show care and concern, and that no matter how many mistakes you make, I'm going to keep coming back and I'm going to keep coming back. So I think that's part of what every citizen can do. That's a part of the philosophy of teaching. That's the philosophy of mentoring. Everybody can be that irrationally caring adult for someone else. And you know what? You're that irrationally caring adult for your own children. So why not be it for Black girls, right? And Black boys, like, why not? So when people ask that question, Marshan, I'm like, you need to educate yourself, right? Because so many people don't know what they don't know. So when I go out and I talk about these conversations, people are blown away. What do you mean? I had somebody say there are police in schools. What? Yes, there are police in schools. I've had people say they had no idea that some young people in pockets of this country live and see police officers multiple times a day, every single day. They had no idea, right? No idea what the trauma is like, and the like. So you got to educate yourself. You got to learn. It's like I love what you said, Vivian, about sharing this film, sharing the stories and the narratives, making yourself available. So many people talk about Brian Stevenson being one of them, getting proximate. You need to be out in the community. How can you know, right? If you don't know, you got to know, you got to learn, right? You got to engage, be that mentor, that big brother, big sister, that big mate, not to be, gender binary, big mate for somebody else, right? And then once you learn, once you do your reading, you understand, you got to check yourself. So I know what you said, I love this, Vivian, speak out, say something, see something, say something. I teach this, right? Like I have a training called See Something, Say Something. Guess what it starts with? It's like, see it in yourself, your own implicit biases. So we talked earlier at the start about the fear of Black children living on in the American psyche. That means the average person who walks down the street, walks through a park at dusk, they see a group of white kids, they think it's funny, they think it's cute. This is kids being kids. You see a group of Black kids at dusk, you're afraid. Check yourself, right? Is this irrational manufactured fears that have been passed on from generation to generation that we have to break? That starts with the individual. Then once you learn, you check yourself, speaking up and saying something. What legislative reform you don't have to be a lawmaker, but can I show up? Can I show up at city council and make my piece? Can I collaborate with a group of kids, teenagers, young folks like Naya when she was young? You're older, young woman now, but like you're still young. But when you were a teenager, can I go with her, right, into city council and make a difference. One of the most powerful difference in my life, because I've been an advocate representing children in court. And it wasn't until, some years back where I really began to think about what I could do, and not even just me, but what I could do systemically, was because I went to a city council hearing. And we were fighting some legislation that was going to share your juvenile criminal record with your school system. We thought that was appalling. If a kid makes a mistake and they have a juvenile record, it should stay confidential. It should stay private, and your school should not be notified that you got arrested outside of school. So we were going in to fight that. Let me just tell you, some local advocates got 300 students from the DC public school system to show up at city council. What was supposed to be a 2-hour hearing in front of city council ended up being a 2.5-day hearing, because 300 kids came and they testified before city council and blocked that legislation. So my point is, see something, say something, informally and formally. You can introduce yourself. These are just lay advocates. Me, I had never done any legislative advocacy, but you can show up and participate and create space for young people to speak out, right? Speak out with that rage. That's healthy. The rage, any person with an ounce of human dignity is going to resist and fight back those labels. You tell a Black child over and over again that they're bad and they're criminal, what do you expect them to do? A human being should speak out for themselves. And it might not look like a nice, polite dissertation. Mr. Officer, Mrs. Officer, I don't appreciate the way you've been treating me. Instead, it sounds like an adolescent speaking out. Stop it. What did Naya say? Stop it. You can't do this. You can't do this. And it sounds loud, right? But that's healthy. And we should honor that. We should honor that. So I got carried away too, sorry.
No, thank you. That's fantastic. I want to take this time to thank you, Kris, Naya, and Vivian, for this wonderful discussion. I want to thank the audience for joining us. And I also want to ask the audience to visit Represent Justice website, particularly the On These Grounds and Take Action pages, to learn what you can do to help raise awareness and to help demand change. A few ways that you can get involved is, one, by donating to Vivian's wonderful organization, Every Black Girl Incorporated. You can also ask your congressperson to support federal legislation to abolish juvenile life without parole, as well as the Counseling Not Criminalization Act. Both bills are currently pending in Congress. And if you go to our pages, our website, you can actually find tools that will help you reach out to your congressperson and send a letter to them, and a tweet, and even a phone call. I believe that's the option on there as well. But you can use those tools to reach out to your congressperson and tell them to support those bills. Finally, I also strongly recommend that you all pick up a copy of Kristin Henning's new book, The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalized Black Youth. How America Criminalized Black Youth. I recommend that you all get it, and I have my copies too. And thank you again for joining us, and have a good night. Thank you all.